elements have not particularly been in our favour, so you've probably kind of got through wind and rain. We're delighted to be joined this morning by a fantastic panel to talk about a really important topic. And before I briefly introduce that, just to say, Onward, for those who aren't aware, we're a centre-right think tank. We do work on restoring economic growth in places where it's been lagging, and repairing the social fabric in places where it has frayed. And this is our first time at Labour Conference. We've been delighted to have a range of different events and engage with shadow cabinet members, metro mayors, on some of the big challenges that we think there needs to be a radical cross-party consensus on. Vices in dealing with some of the work, it will be felt on high streets, on town centres, it will be felt by small businesses, by individuals and by families. And so this morning's topic about the everyday economy is a really important discussion about how some of these economic turmoils are going to be felt in our towns and in our cities. And in particular, we're delighted to be partnering with Nationwide on the important role that banks as institutions, and particularly retail banks looking at individuals and families, have on addressing some of those economic challenges through savings, through mortgages, and important things like access to cash that we're going to hear about. So, an enormously important topic, really delighted to have the panel. Let me introduce them. So, first, Anna's been in the Shadow Cabinet since the Shadow front bench since 2021. Had a range of different roles while he's been there, mainly around Bays, but also in international trade. And Bill, unfortunately, has to run away at about 25 past, so we're going to squeeze all the insight out of him for the next 20 minutes or so. Joining Bill in the centre there, we've got Paul Swinney, the Director of Research and Policy at the Centre for Cities, a fantastic think tank that we do on speed dial to comment on what's happening with football and city centres and a range of different indicators. We've then got Kat Farrow on my left, the coordination lead for the Access to Cash group. Kat works at the Access to Cash Action Group, making sure that particularly vulnerable individuals have access to cash and can engage in the economy more broadly. He was previously in a senior communications role at the Parliamentary and Health Services Ombudsman. And finishing off our panel, from Nationwide we have Tom Riley. Tom is the Director of Banking and Savings at Nationwide. He's been at the organisation for 15 years in a range of different roles around mortgages and savings, and is involved in the launch of things like Nationwide's Start to Save proposition and a range of different really innovative instruments that Nationwide are using to support the economy. So we'll be delighted to hear from Tom and his reflections on some of the comments from the panel. So let's kick off then with a few opening remarks about this topic. How do we energise the everyday economy, get liquidity, get cash flow investment?
Plans to around the country. How do you recover the ground that's been lost? One of the things that has changed things dramatically has been COVID. We now have hybrid working. We now have people living and working more often in and around their towns and spending their money there. And actually, I've seen a number of really vibrant, high-quality businesses in hospitality setting up in our towns and doing really well very, very early on. So there's some interesting changes that have been accelerated in the way that people live and work. But ultimately, go back to what we started with, which is the big picture. We've seen over the last 12 and a half years, or in fact, the comparison better pre-COVID growth over the period of since 2010 was 1.8% on average. When Labour was in office, it was 2.3 before the global financial crisis. That difference in growth level is really, really significant. And our international comparisons are. I'll just talk about I'll refer back to the enhancement on Sunday, which was the latest part of our Dash for Clean Growth, which is the plan for us to be electricity self-sufficient by 2030 by investing in offshore and onshore wind, which we're very strong in this region, by investing potentially in tidal too. You look out the window, you can see the tide rushing past. There are really exciting plans just here in the river to do just that. Expanding solar, nuclear's got a key role to play. But the other part of that plan that we announced last year at conference was what we called the national mission to install insulation in 19 million homes. And I think that the investment in renewable energy plays its part in regional growth, because this will be the biggest area, or one of the biggest areas in the country that delivers investment and jobs in renewable energy. that retrofit strategy will deliver 500,000 jobs. And the key thing about the retrofit strategy is that the poorest quality housing in the country is in the poorest communities. It's in those towns, it's in those suburbs that really have struggled more than the rest of the country. And it's an opportunity to support the smaller builders and places like that. It's a perfect example of where we can invest in jobs and skills. There's a great company in this region called EcoG.
There's a question here about that's very much a short-term response. And clearly just subsidising people to consume more and more energy is not where we need to be in the longer term. So then what you do in terms of the longer-term response? There's retrofitting, definitely. So then what you do in terms of the longer-term response? There's retrofitting, definitely, in order to deal with some of that. I think it's a bit disappointing that we've had a number of policies that have been announced, I think, over recent years, which then got canned before we even got any sort of certainty and longevity produced into the market, and that created all sorts of problems in terms of what suppliers would then supply. The schemes just didn't work. So government support hasn't been long enough, hasn't been in place long enough in order to facilitate these sorts of things. But then getting right back to your question, Adam, the key thing in the long term is about having a growing economy. And that's where the levelling up agenda becomes so important, which it's unclear now, exactly what's going to happen with that in terms of the current leadership. But the reason in part why places like Blackburn and Burnley are so exposed is because their economy struggles. So they haven't got that money in their pockets in order to be able to deal with the crisis, and where that might well be the case a little bit further south. So it's then think about what you do about trying to encourage these places to get going. I think on an everyday economy perspective, that's important about making sure we've got some good, decent jobs in these sectors. The real challenge for some of those places is that they haven't got some of those high productivity, what we describe as exporting or stable investment in from high scale to high productivity businesses. And that's what policy needs to focus on from a value creation perspective, from expanding the size of the economy. And that comes down to skills, that comes down to investment within city centres, it comes down to investment.
Disappear completely. That actually led to some pilots in 8 communities across the UK, funded by the banks, so we could test what actually will support communities in terms of cash access and basic banking. And we found in those pilots that particularly, the biggest driver of cash dependencies is income. Some people think it's age. Age is a factor, but it's primarily income because cash is still the most effective way of budgeting for many people. So these pilots gave birth to the concept of a banking hub, which is essentially a shared branch. You have on one side, you have a counter where you can go and carry out your transactions in cash, bill payments, balance inquiries, all those things. And on the other side of the room, you have your private room where you can go and talk to somebody from your bank. And what we found is lots of incredible findings actually from the communities that we have put banking hubs in. So one is down in Rochester in Essex, the other's up in Cambuslang in South Lanarkshire. And the findings have been pretty astonishing actually. So in terms of regeneration, we found that having small businesses able to deposit cash on the high street easily, conveniently, locally has made a massive difference. We've got examples of businesses starting up, for example in Rochford, where they were planning to go cashless, and actually because they had the hub on the high street, they were able to just go deposit their cash. They said no, we're going to actually keep using cash. Can support more local people. Their insurance premiums went down because they don't hold cash on their premises. So it's made a massive difference in those communities. Another thing I'd flag is in Cambuslang, found that a lot of the elderly are more likely to go to that Anchor unit on the high street now, to go and get their £20 out and go and have a cup of tea and go and do their own shopping rather than relying on somebody else to do it for them. So we found it's brought a degree of independence to those older people as well. So we've been pretty astonished by the results, and certainly on the small business side, cash acceptance still feels really key to supporting more vulnerable people. The other thing to think about, with cash access is not everybody has £10 in their bank account to go to an ATM. Some people have £4.72 left in their bank, in their account to go and do their shopping. And what having these services enables people to do is go and manage their money properly. They can see it in front of them. They can't go to the ATM because they don't have that amount of money. So I think as the cost of living crisis continues to bite, these services are going to be increasingly important in some of these communities. So at the moment we've got 2 hubs up and running. We've now announced 25 more, and we fully expect to be supporting lots more communities over the next few years. and particularly in those areas that we've been talking about where there is a real need for some regeneration to support vulnerable people.
Fantastic. Really interesting planning, honestly, and that model, one that would be interesting to see how it's replicated in terms of policy in other parts of the country. Tom, let me come to you then. So, two from Paul and from Kat, quite different ends of the economy, from Bill as well, right? So, one, industrial strategy, how we get these big exporting sectors. The other, the small and medium enterprises that often are quite separate from that large exporting economy, but nonetheless enormously important, require different support. So how do you as a financial institution think about that range of support? What would society target some of your services and support at places that are left behind?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The needs that we see presenting themselves in branch do vary greatly. If you go into some of the more areas of the country, we'll see a much higher use of cash. We do then would back up the experience that Kat described, which is a lot of those members who are coming in to transact in cash. Actually, they have, and I do think it can sometimes be a lazy assumption to think that people need help with budgeting, when actually they need help with more fundamental challenges in terms of income and outgoings. So that, again, that's where our sort of cost of living outline comes in. But we will find then, as you can imagine, in more affluent parts of the country, that our services will be much less focused on cash provision. Much fewer actual branch terminals. It's more about support, advice, savings, investments, so on and so forth. So we have to be really responsive to those local needs.
Yeah, very interesting. Paul, I want to come to you and I'll open up to some questions from the floor. So you talked about the need to focus on the value-added activity, in particular exporting. But then there is also this call to deal with the more fundamental economy, the everyday economy. Now, of course, you need to do a bit of both in terms of policy. But in as much as there are a limited amount of time to get the attention of the media or a limited amount of things you can push civil servants on, a new Labour government looking to come in, there'll be these competing tensions, these competing pushes. So do you think that the everyday economy is something that should be kind of secondary, or the real focus should be on the exporting side of things? Or how would you advise a Labour government to balance those two areas of focus?
So I think it's about balance, isn't it? And certainly when Rachel Lee's spoken in the past, I think she's been very much sort of focused on, it's about the everyday economy. And this is my thing, and she's written pamphlets on it and things like that. The issue for a place like a Sheffield or a Barnsley or a Burnley is not that it hasn't got enough of the everyday economy, it's that it hasn't got enough of those growth engines. And what we see is that we think sort of split the economy into sort of exporting and local service, or exporting and everyday economy, however you want it to define them. The high street is part of the everyday economy. It does well if the exporting sector is doing well. If that's bringing money into the economy to put money into people's pockets to go and spend. They haven't got that bit in the first place, and then you've got a problem in the everyday economy. So I think the ideas of trying to boost productivity in the everyday government use.
It's a really good question there. So the folks that picked up on the stream, Big Society Capital question there about access to finance and what are some of the interventions. I'm going to come to you first, Tom, and then come to you. So Tom, what are some of the levers that we need to see, either from financial institutions or indeed government-backed levers there might be?
Yeah, so I think it's quite different for different providers. So interestingly, so Nationwide is very closely involved with Big Society Capital via the dormant assets scheme. So that's something actually that I'm the industry champion for banks and building societies, and has been really, I think, quite powerful in unlocking funds and distributing funds in a way that actually generates growth rather than simply being the original money that's handed out itself. With our position though as a personal finance provider, we've generally tended not to be utilisers of government-backed kind of securities and other schemes, and actually focus on making sure that we continue to lend, particularly to first-time buyers, because our focus is so much on mortgages. So that tends to be our approach, and therefore that does make them, I'm afraid, not necessarily best placed to comment on the broader support for kind of SMEs, other local enterprises, etc. But I'm sure that others on the panel will have a view on that side of things.
Yeah, well, let me come to you, Kat. So you talked about some of the SMEs that you encountered in your pilots and their challenges with either access to capital or liquidity or access to finance, particularly finance. So tell us a bit about what you think either government needs to do or financial institutions that you work with could do.
So it's a really good question around the SMEs. So back to the 2019 Access to Cash review, that made it called on government essentially to protect cash access for these small businesses, which are the real powerhouses of local communities. And that's